Hey, oh, well, here we are. Book club. Some of y'all are regulars. Some of y'all are coming for the first time. I know it's always true that some of you have done your homework and read the book, and some of you haven't. It's all okay. But this is what we're talking about tonight. And I know that folks are going to kind of trickle in, but this trickle in here. This is Circle of Hope, Eliza Griswold. I'll introduce her in a second. She's here. Whoop, whoop. What's up, Eliza? She's eating. I told her she could chill for a minute while I let people know about a few things. So there is a lot going on. We got an election happening, a lot at stake. Red Letter Christians is not partisan, but that doesn't mean that we are not political. I think a part of loving our neighbor as ourselves means that we don't ignore the policies that affect their lives. And so we're doing a ton of cool stuff, y'all. This is, as we prayed and thought about it, this is what we decided. Let's have a series of virtual events around the election, the week of the election, that are all around the idea vote for love. Vote for love over fear. And so every night, the beginning of November, we're going to focus on a different thing too. We'll have like vote for love for victims of violence. And we're gonna listen to this, y'all. I'm gonna just throw it out there. Like we're gonna have Munther Isaac from Bethlehem in the West Bank with us. We'll also have Sharon Risher, who her family was killed by Dylan Roof, and yet she is against the death penalty. She's powerful force on gun violence. So she's going to be there one night. Ben Cohen from Ben and Jerry's Ice Cream will be with us one night, voting for love. We will also have uh, an entire evening around voting for love for immigrants and refugees. We'll have a night that will be talking about voting for love for our unhoused neighbors and for folks in poverty. We're going to have the presiding bishop, former presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, Eliza. Michael Curry will be with us one night. So anyway, you're going to see all that. It's not even been public yet. We're going to blast it out on everything, but go ahead and reserve every night, 8 o'clock, November 1st through the 4th. Reverend William Barber is going to be with us on November 1st to kick that week off. He'll be our guest for morning prayer. For folks that don't know, every month we try to do morning prayer from our common prayer book, this one, and we do that at 9 o'clock in the morning on Eastern time. So that's all happening, y'all. We are also in November having a Peacemaker Summit here in Philly. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." So some folks will have Gaza and Palestine and Israel in mind. Others will be working on gun violence. There's folks that are working in the school to de-escalate violence. We're also going to fire up all the forges. So we're going to have like all kinds of blacksmiths and melting guns. So you'll see all that. But for now, it's book club. And we have Eliza Griswold, who is my friend. I'm so glad to call you my friend, and we'll talk about that. But you are also a Pulitzer Prize winning writer and wonderful journalist. You've written about lots of friends, some folks that are a part of Red Letter Christians. You write a lot for the New Yorker, but you've written all kinds of great stuff. And it's always fun to be together. So thanks for doing this. We're going to get
Thank
you
you
on.
so
There you
much
go.
for having me.
Cool.
I'm so psyched to be here.
So I also feel like I almost need to say that this is a really different book. I mean, we've done book club for like 2 or 3 years every month, like just celebrating great books. This one is a great book, but it's also uh, in some ways was really hard for me to read. The subtitle is A Reckoning with Love, Power, and Justice in an American Church. And Circle of Hope, as you will hear from Eliza, is actually a network of congregations in Philadelphia that have been sort of kind of a community of folks that cross-pollinate with our work here at the Simple Way. It's kind of like we've been on these parallel tracks, but a lot of our friendships overlap. The Circle of Hope started around the same time as the Simple Way, our community here in North Philly. So first, I think, Eliza, I think it could be a little important and fun to talk about how we met and how you kind of first connected to Circle of Hope, because you tell that a little bit in the book.
Yeah, of course. So, you know, I came to Circle of Hope through you. And, I came to Philly to write about you and as really a leader of this movement that I found very exciting, which is this radical evangelical movement that, is small but mighty. And its influence, I think, like people are always asking me, well, how big is it really? I'm like, small, who knows? Because so many like people who are in this space are like in other places. They're not particularly interested in being counted, right?
Mm,
But the power is about like restoring the moral heart to this call and the historical reality of what evangelicalism is. So it's like
mm,
that still evangelical book that I probably read 5 or 6 years ago, but like in living color, right? So I wanted to write about you because I love the melting of the guns, but partly I love the melting of the guns because it takes back from the right this idea of Bible believing or biblical literalism from
mm,
from the Christian right, which is like that's a form of claiming authority that like the left has kind of ceded or the progressives have ceded or everybody but the right is ceded. But and I'm like, okay, Shane is doing exactly like he's following the Bible to the letter. Why is that not Bible believing? So that was what I was thinking about,
A little
right?
different version of fundamentalism. I'm a fundamentalist when you take the Sermon on the Mount or the Jubilee or melt your guns in the garden.
Right, right. But like, why don't we talk about like why do we see this term and this authority? It's like, oh well, the conservatives really follow the Bible. No, they don't, right? Like, so anyway, but this was years ago. This was kind of before we were in the like Christian nationalism. Like, obviously, you've been aware of that for a really long time, and so have I. But this is before that was so in our faces, right?
Mm,
But so this alternative way of being deeply faithful and devoting one's life to Jesus was very compelling to me. And I wanted to tell that story through you. And then I was already thinking about how to tell a wider story. And when I was down watching you poke, the barrel of an AK into your mobile forge in front of the Simple Way, there behind you were a small band of earnest folks who I knew exactly from a distance that they were members of a church or something like that, or a merry band of Christians and Jesus followers. And I asked you, and you're like, oh yeah, that's my church. So I asked you if you would introduce me to them. And I think we met at Johnny's congregation because it was closest to you. And you're like, yeah, come along, we'll go to this. But I want you to meet Rachel too. And then that's how the book began.
mm, mm. Ooh. And what ended up happening for me and Katie is we were away from Philadelphia for a lot of what turns out to be a real crisis in the congregate network of congregations. And you were fully embedded there. You're texting me and calling me, and I'm living in a van down by the river down in North Carolina in our little tiny house bus. And I think that's part of what was hard for me to read is like this community, that Circle of Hope that's meant so much to me over the years. And yet, I've really never had any leadership role. I've never been a pastor there, but it was a life-giving, it has been a life-giving space for me. And part of that's because I can just go and unplug and not be on, but just worship. And, we used to do a lot of punk rock worship and all kinds of wild and wacky artists. And Salters were a part of it, as you say in the book. And there's a Salter incense smell now, thanks to your book. Anyway, there's like, but it was a lot of folks that were activists and artists and loved Jesus, and many of them had come out of a more fundamentalist background. So, I mean, if I was trying to create a genre for this, it's like a tragedy. It's like it's sort of a spiritual tragedy in some ways. But you like as you're writing, you can't help but feel both grief and a lot of empathy because of how complicated the layers are. So I thought, I'd let you talk a little bit about how you, as you immersed yourself, even like I think your background of, um, embedded journalism, like you just kind of dove full on. You walked alongside of people. I mean, you tell the stories of coming to rescue someone out of addiction, probably a few blocks from my house here and stuff. And so you kind of like are full on in it. And, you know, uh, maybe say a little bit about how you um, figured out. I mean, even how you decided to continue writing this, even as it becomes like really uncomfortable at times as you're reading it.
Yeah, I mean, so after you introduced me to Johnny, I told him what wanted to do, that I wanted to immerse myself in this church and follow along with its life for a while. And this was early 2019. And Johnny was super into it. And he said, okay, why don't you come to a Monday morning pastors meeting and talk to the other three, and we'll make a decision together. Because that's how Circle does things, right? How is the Spirit calling them to move? And so I went and had that meeting, and the project, as I laid it out, was, look, I want to follow you guys because I want to tell this alternative story, right, of what following Jesus actually looks like in 2019 and for the next few years. And I imagined that it would be a largely positive story. I mean, sort of funny subculture, like zany, lovable, people doing wacky things in the name of Jesus. And it would have import, but I didn't envision what happened. None of us did, right? And so what happened instead is, as you said, this real crisis. It's a story of a death. I don't know if all deaths are tragic. They're like,
Hmm.
what is tragic, I think, is how people miss one another. Like, and for me as a journalist, that was the most challenging space, and one in which I think I overreached more than I typically do, because I understood. I was in conversation with everybody, and I understood some of what they were thinking, but not really saying clearly to one another. And there were definitely moments where I was like, why don't you just say what you're really thinking, which is
Hmm.
not really my role. But I definitely did step in that space sometimes.
Hmm.
You know, it was not even a question of, there was never, like, I was worried. I mean, quite honestly, like, because immersion, the kind of journalism that I do, involves seeing a lot. It involves like being in somebody's life and then they kind of forget I'm around. And once pandemic started and everything went on Zoom, I was like, there's no story here, right? Like, just from a purely narrative, forget the ethical and sort of larger moral challenges of it. Like, from just the craft point of view, I was like, I can't write about hundreds of hours on Zoom. But
Hmm.
then this is a story of all of us, because all of us were having hundreds of hours on Zoom. All of us were, I can't speak for everybody, but having, like, the pastor in my church either fired or left. He had some kerfuffle during, like, this is what was happening, right?
Hmm.
Um, Communities of faith were being incredibly stretched, especially ones that liked to be incarnate, that liked to be together in person. Um, and if togetherness was your jam, the pandemic was a struggle, you know? So all of that to say, I just kept following what was happening. And on top of that, the book begins with the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, and it
Hmm.
stops on purpose because, you know, I believe that, as hard as it was, that the Holy Spirit was, I mean, that's hard language for me to use because I don't consider myself a Christian, but I do believe, or often feel, the presence of a power greater than myself moving in the universe.
I think
And
you're about to get Pentecostal on us tonight.
I'm
Yeah.
doing it. I'm going to just drop on the floor. You're going to see the Zoom go crazy.
I
Bibbity
got
babbity
mine. I
boop.
still got it in me. I'm ready. I'm ready.
Whoopity doop doop doop. It's a little
Oh,
hard for this Episcopalian, I'd sooner sing, whatever, joyful, joyful. Anyway, so um, so what happened was a challenge to everybody.
yeah.
But and the idea that the four of them allowed me to continue to follow was really beautiful. And I think a lot of integrity in that. And I hope that what I made honors them, even though it's difficult, although that's not the primary function. The primary function is to reveal a larger truth that hopefully helps us all live into something better, right?
That's
And
what I wanted to ask you next.
yeah,
Because I mean, at a certain point, your motivation or your decision to write the book probably had to change. I mean, I felt you when you started. You're like, this could be really inspirational. It could help people think outside the box. Not all evangelicals or Christians are the
yeah.
same or whatever. Like, and yet, like, there comes a point where you go, man, am I just writing this book? Like, is it just to expose air the dirty laundry, or is there something redemptive that could come out of it? I mean, you're very gracious as you write, but as you wrote this in particular and decided to go ahead and do it, what are some of the things that you thought it might offer other people? Because I know you're not just after, making money from writing a book that, some folks could say was a little like reading somebody's private diary or something, but like what's still your hope that people might read the book and take away from it?
I really believe that each of the four pastors and yeah, I'll just stay with the four current pastors the book's really about. Were not believe it was overwhelmingly evident they were each following Jesus and like in the best possible way, and that like that they could discern, right? And that I honor that, and did it look like dumpster diving and anarcho primitivism and some of the zany, like, things that I hope to see that I thought would be funny, fun stories and attractive? No. But is it less attractive? Is it less compelling or authentic when people struggle in their faith to do the right thing? And one thing that's unusual about this book, that's certainly not true of the articles I write, is that it really felt beyond me. Like the last book that I wrote about people who were a family who was battling an oil and gas company that because they'd gotten sick from fracking had a certain form that I understood. Like these people have been wronged, right? This is an environmental story of like people who've been wronged by society. This book is something else, and it's really alive. And that's what makes me think that I don't quite know yet. I don't know that
Mhm.
I'll ever know how. I think it's I think it's imbued with something larger, and it has absolutely nothing to do with me because I finished it. Sorry, I have this little cuddle girl here. I finished it because that was my responsibility, and yeah, I mean, I had to finish it, but
Mhm.
I didn't imagine it would get read, really. That's how I felt about the last book too. Like, I'm like, who wants to read this? Not because it's painful. That didn't occur to me. It occurred to me reporting it. And it occurs to me every single day about the four pastors and the Rod and Gwen White, the founders of the church. When I talk about the book, they listen to a lot. I don't. Like, I don't read reviews. I don't listen to podcasts a lot, but they follow this a lot. And I think about the impact of having a book that chronicles some of the most painful things that happened to them and that they did.
Yeah. And I wonder if, like, I think it's probably time, especially like for folks that may not have read it yet, to like identify a little bit of what became so complicated, right? I mean, there's so many layers of this. That's why y'all got to read the whole book. But first of all, I would start by saying one of the things that you note in the book is that 80% of church-going Americans belong to a racially homogenous congregation, right? 80%. And I heard a pastor say this. He was a megachurch pastor, Eliza, that said, the easiest thing to do is to build a church around people who look like you, vote like you, and eat like you. Like and so part of the tensions that are being held in Circle of Hope is by having a diverse community or aspiring to have a more diverse community. But I mean, as you think of like generationally, like I think of incomes and stuff. So I mean, there's a lot, women leadership, like all this. So like those layers become complicated, but they're also outside forces. COVID, the George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement, like all these different layers. So, talk a little bit about how this became like kind of a perfect storm in some ways of like so many different converging things that were trying to be navigated at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, so what happened really is that the founders of the church, Rod and Gwen White, who were wonderful hippie Jesus freaks, who'd come to Philadelphia and started the church in 96. They, by the time pandemic has begun, as they understand it, they have handed the church over to the next generation and that is 4 pastors. And that is their son, Ben, and who's white, that, and their friend, Johnny Rashid, or another pastor, Johnny Rashid, who's Egyptian American, and 2 women, Julie Hoke and Rachel Sensenig. And it's a complicated endeavor because the whites are gone, but not really gone. They are working out what it means to retire, kind of, but they're still very present in the church. So all of that is the backdrop before pandemic hits, right?
Mm-hmm.
And who's going to lead and how is definitely a part of this. And there are many ways in which I think, although I couldn't have named it at the time, and they certainly couldn't have, but Johnny and Ben came into competition, some kind of competition over not explicitly leading the church, but leading, being the sort of focal theological leader whose theology was going to lead. And that happened early in pandemic. You could see, Ben had some reservations about going online for church. He wanted to keep the church open because Anabaptists don't, as he said, like if you can go to Home Depot, you should be able to go to church. They're not governed by the laws of the world. And that put him theologically in a weird space, right? Because all of a sudden he's like, Christian nationalists who are like, we're not closing our church, even though that was not at all his theology. And then you have Johnny saying, loving your neighbor means staying away from your neighbor. And so we're going to close the church. And that ultimately was the theological argument that put them onto Zoom. And Zoom itself was, I don't know, Shane, if you saw any of those churches, but those services, they were rough.
Yeah.
Because they're not used to Zoom, and Johnny and Ben just started riffing on scripture, and Julie and Rachel were largely silent. And so some of the power dynamics that were painful in the church really got forefronted on screens, as did disagreements, because as anyone would say, people love to disagree and talk it out, discern together, but that's a lot harder on Zoom. And people got nasty, and as so many communities did on Zoom and in the chats and in the email threads and on Slack. I mean, it was like a disembodied smackdown, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
And so, I mean, one of the things that it strikes me that is pretty difficult in all this is that there's an element of circle coming out of, as you said, Rod and Gwen White coming out of the Jesus movement, kind of old hippies. There's an anarchistic part of it, right? And I mean that in the best sense, the truest sense of the word, which is anarchy of power. There's a different power dynamic. There's an explicit leaning on scripture where Jesus says things like the rulers of this world lord over one another. That's not how we roll. There's a sense of kind of aspirational horizontal power. But then, and I've seen this many times, and it's part of why the Simple Way always had a different entity from Circle of Hope, is that there is an implicit power structure, right? And at one point you call it the tyranny of structurelessness. This idea that we're all leading this together, but then there comes a point where many people within Circle, especially some of the leaders of color, like really feel like, oh wow, no, we aren't all stakeholders of equal stake.
No, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. There's a masking, and it was not intentional, but there was a masking of how power really worked, and there were explicit things like, if you're charismatic, right? Like if people like you and you can grow a small group called a cell, then you're going to be a leader, right? Like you're going to then kind of, they don't say move up because they don't think it's hierarchical. But if people are drawn to you and you're successful at growing the church, you are on track to possibly become a pastor, right? And so charisma, all power, all of those were realities, right? They just came by different names. And I think one of the things that's tragic, but very real, is that there was a lot of hope that utopian senses of things would transcend worldly powers, right? But sometimes those worldly powers, they're just real and they need to be named, because if they're unnamed, they can become more insidious. And so yeah, anarchy, except that when you violate a quote unquote proverb of the church, you're going to get smacked, right? Or, you come in and you advocate, you prove yourself to be an activist for gay rights at a time where that's not cool to be an activist about gay rights. You're going to get smacked.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And one of the other things that I thought of as I was reading it, I read it really, really carefully, and I took my time. I'm a slow reader. I like to read slow, and I took my time on it. But one of the things that kind of hit me is that, in evangelicalism, or I think just in Christianity in general, there's often this differentiation between personal salvation and social transformation. We often have a hard time holding those together. So like there were people would be like, well, welcoming immigrants, every Christian should welcome the stranger, but the government doesn't really influence policy. And it feels like there's a little bit of that's at work when it came to like the discernment around Black Lives Matter, right? It's like the church is about Jesus and leading people to Jesus. And our faith should activate us. So we hope that you go out, get involved, get arrested. I mean, half the congregation of Circle of Hope's been, activists. Some of the pastors have gotten arrested. I've been arrested with them doing, social justice work. So there's definitely like the appreciation of that. But when it came to like our congregation is going to, in a united voice, make a statement against systemic racism and police brutality, and that is important to the most prominent, leaders, not just, Black leaders, but many of the leaders of the church. But then that became complicated, right? Like, no, it's not something we're going to do as a church.
That's
exactly. It's not necessarily going to be a proverb. And I was reading that, just kind of like pulling my hair out a little, like, not because I knew the answer, but like, it's just that's really hard, right? So I don't know if you want to say more about that, but that's one thing that struck me.
That's 100% right. And there was a real argument to be made that Ben and Rod made very accurately, which is like, activism has cost church. That like one of the reasons that people peeled away from Circle of Hope over time is because something else became their God, right? And often it was a cause. And so they saw themselves, quite honestly, in tension with social justice that wasn't centered on Jesus, right? And I thought I understood that. And I thought that made sense to me, right? That they were being honest. So where that became more complicated is when there is a shift in the culture and a shift in the call among their own people of color, that we really need you guys to do this with us now. We really need you to and the statement was that really set things off was pretty innocuous. I mean, to call the Fraternal Order of the Police to count is not
Right.
is not a radical thing to do. But, and everybody agreed that the Fraternal Order of Police were like the devil, including Rod and Gwen White, who did not want to issue a statement. So it had to do with this tension over what is the world, right? What is the
Yeah.
world and what is our role in it? And there are many issues and times where that question, the skepticism made more sense. The depth of the suffering and the despair and the urgency after George Floyd, and among the in the church itself, there was no backing away from that. There was no maybe we should consider it. That very act of hesitation was painful, and to the people in the church, you
Yeah, and
know.
I will say that like it also raises questions about, I mean, one of the things you walk away with are some real unresolved questions. I had a lot of empathy. I think that you really like bring that out, some of the truest and difficult parts of each of, we're all complicated people. But I also thought like, man, I mean, Circle of Hope has had a hard time making decisions as a united front on some of these social issues. But like the Methodist Church made a powerful statement on the death penalty, one of the best. Like Pope Francis has been a powerhouse on so many fronts, including, Gaza and so it's like, um, is there a way to navigate that? So I kind of like, I was feeling it through all that. And it also made me think like our, our I don't know, I don't want to say like hatred, our suspicion of institutions, right? Kind of gets called in check too, because you go, wow, we've got some of the same principalities and powers in this little autonomous group. I mean, it is a part of a denomination, but like functioning basically on its own, some of the same stuff, is in us that's in the Episcopal Church or the Catholic Church or whatever, right?
Even more than that, I think that sense of exceptionalism, Circle of Hope is different, is pretty toxic. And like I noticed it from the beginning because, to own my own context, right? I do come out of my dad, you know, consecrated the first openly gay bishop in the Episcopal Church in 2003. That led to a schism. So I had seen firsthand like the cost and the wrestle with with sexuality with the world, and that was 2003. And here we are in 2019 and 2020, and Circle of Hope is claiming to be radical and progressive, and is behind the Episcopal Church and kind of throwing shade on like, well, they're behind or backwards. I'm like, look, I'm just sociologically a Christian over here, but like, man, get your act together. You are behind the times, and I
Mm,
don't. And here the times matter, right?
mm, yeah.
Um, and I think that there was something there that you're saying, like there was some regressive, some like we're different and we can get away with doing it differently. That wasn't right. And that's
Hmm.
part of the anti-institutionalism. Like the checks and balances within institutions have value, not
Yeah.
all of them, but they do protect people, you know.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah.
Yeah, let me just say, for if you're just tuning in, y'all, it's book club. Red Letter Christian Circle of Hope is our book this month. We're talking about it with Eliza Griswold. So, one of the other things I think that's tricky about this network of congregations is that at the end of the day, there's sort of this unity of all the different congregations, or there's this aspiration to be one, but there's not a lot of room for people to find their own way. And you do such a good job of showing like, Rachel in South Philly is discerning some things different. Maybe it's even priorities than, the congregation in Germantown. And, her community of folks in recovery is different. Not all of them, but many of them, that are making decisions together is different from folks in Camden, right? That like, and even folks that are African American are not all seeing the same or identifying the same, or having the same experience, or maybe seeing the same power structures. And I was thinking of another congregation that is very close to me, that the pastoral team has discerned the sacrament of marriage differently. In fact, there are some pastors in this same congregation that will not marry couples on principle, same gendered couples or non-binary couples. Others in that congregation feel very compelled by their faith to marry folks, and love is love, and like any lifelong commitment between two individuals, it would be a pastoral decision, right? Like
Yeah.
and not everybody's going to marry everyone, period. If someone, is an abusive relationship or whatever, but I thought that they're able to hold these tensions. And in Circle, there wasn't really room for that, for one pastor or one church to discern something like sexuality different from another one, because it always came back to a certain hierarchy. But they're also, another layer of that is they're a part of a denomination. So there are pastors that if they married a same-sex couple, they could lose their license from the Brethren in Christ. So there's like forces from inside and from outside that were making this all so complicated. But the reason I mention that is there's people listening to this conversation, I'm sure, that are discerning that within their own organizations or denominations. The United Methodist Church just split because they couldn't hold attention on this. And so, I mean, I think there's whole organizations that are fracturing around some of these same difficulties of, like, are we forcing people to believe, one way or another? And is this a vetting, like, this is a deal breaker. If you don't see eye to eye on this, then you're not a part of this community, or you can't work for this organization.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. That these questions, mostly around sexuality, right? But I think one thing that sets Circle apart is that so many people had come from fundamentalism and believed that they'd found at Circle the right way, a better way. And here they were with their chosen family, believing things rightly. And so belief took on more of a uniformity and was a code of rightness in a way. Well, we believe the right things. And I think that's a dangerous idea, no matter what the content of those beliefs is. And sure, that's relativism that I'm talking about, but it's more profound than that. There wasn't a lot of space for people there had been space. And now the question then becomes, on the other side, like if there's space for people to believe different things, who's getting hurt in that, right?
Mm-hmm.
What does accommodation look like? And I think that Johnny in particular would say that accommodating people who don't believe that same-sex marriages are okay, accommodating people like that in your church is harmful to queer folks, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Many people would say that, because so it's complicated. What's the greater call from God, to stay together or to follow belief, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the other things that you show is the complexity of not recognizing social location, that we're in different places. The old saying, like, where you sit determines what you see. But then you also see, like, someone like Ben, one of the pastors, that he's a big white guy. And at one point you said, like, kind of anytime he says something about Johnny, it's going to be through the lens of white supremacy, even if it's like, you should use Twitter less or whatever, it's still like, it's all still going to be through a lens of a person who's coming from power, partly because his parents are also founders of the church. And so it's like, how do you have that kind of relationship, where there can be trust and honesty, and you can say that wasn't a great sermon, and it's not because I'm just telling you that because you're not white, or it's hard, right?
Right. And also when a kind of claiming moral authority becomes, like, when that's at play, then and that's, I mean, that is in our culture already. Like if you say the wrong thing, you're canceled, right? I mean, Johnny writes a defense of cancel culture in one of his blogs. Um, Now, there is also moral reality there. And what's weird is that it overlaps with Anabaptism and shunning, right? And that's
Hmm.
where it gets tricky because many people who'd been around Circle for a long time talked to me about who'd felt cast out for different reasons, mostly divorce, talked to me about how they felt deliberately shunned by the community and in very specific ways, like we were told not to do this and not to do this. And so in a way, what is cancel culture but it's another form of shunning. So to say people can't participate because they have violated the or they're hurting the inside of the community is something within Circle's DNA,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, it's very interesting to watch that all play out. And there are not a lot of answers there, which but doesn't mean it's all problem. It just means that it's still being felt through, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think the collision, one of the things that comes across really strongly all through the book is a collision between the personal and the social, right? And you're like, yo, I don't think you should be pastoring this congregation, and it's not because you're um, bisexual or demisexual, or it's because you're going through a divorce and you're figuring yourself out. And like, I'm just not sure anyone going through a divorce should be in the place where they've got that responsibility, and a congregation is going to inevitably be torn apart through those relationships. And so that personal and social, and I mean, and yet we're all kind of working out who we are, but that becomes really complicated when um, your personal journey begins to also really hemorrhage through the larger congregation or relationship. I think that became pretty clear. Yeah, I think I've tried to have a lot of conversations with people that I care about in Circle of Hope, and it's really, really I mean, it's hard because these are real people that I was thinking of Rachel Held Evans. One time she said, she's riffing off of Henry Nouwen's idea that we're wounded healers. But I think it was Rachel that said, we should lead out of our scars, but not out of our open wounds. And
Oh,
and I think
wow.
that's something I thought of, several times as I was reading. Like,
Oh, wow. That's beautiful. I didn't know she'd said that. Yeah, I mean, Johnny was very aware in particular that he got to a point where he needed to separate from the church because he was leading out of a place of woundedness. And you mentioned the word real people, and I think that is one thing that's really hard about this book and even this conversation because these four incredible, beautiful, tender humans exist and are walking in the world now. And this
mhm,
record of a painful time where they did some things that nobody is proud of, it's it exists. And it's a weird thing that like one thing that Julie has pointed out to me that I really want to just make sure that I'm saying clearly is like as much as these conflicts are personal, they're structural, right? And
yeah,
so for Julie, I think one of the things that like it's just that the book can be read, and I hope I think we often say with reporting like reporting isn't there. It's it's a record of the reporter's consciousness. It's not like
mm,
some objective truth. So I just hope that there's enough in the book that makes it clear that it's not a soap opera.
yeah,
I've never read it that way. I think I haven't had anybody say to me they've read it that way. I've had such incredible graciousness from people at the church. I don't know if that's also because the culture is pretty kind. So if people are really angry, I'm not hearing it, you
hmm
know? I mean,
hmm
I don't know, Shane. What are you what are you hearing?
Um, Well, I think I hear a lot of folks that almost are just tired. There's just sort of a fatigue. Like it feels like
Yeah.
just an impasse, right? Like, and so where do we go from here is kind of the question, you know, and people that, and I think there's folks too that the part of why I wanted to ask you, you know, opening why you decided to continue to write the book is because I know that you want redemptive things and good things to come out of it. And I think there probably are some folks that haven't read it because they're not sure it will be encouraging.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think I hear that a lot. I hear a lot. I didn't want to read it. I was afraid to read it, and I love it. What I mean, I want to be careful saying that because, like, come on, it's to me. But and I know there, I know the book is rough for some people, in particular the whites. Um, but I don't want to. Yeah, it's an interesting thing too, because I feel that ethically, like I can talk about people's experiences within the frame of the book, but like when people ask me what the pastors are doing now, I'm like, I can tell you vaguely. I haven't, like, I'm in touch with everybody to varying degrees, but like I'm not going to tell you. I don't have the right. I'm not reporting on them now. This thing is closed, and that is its own kind of hardness, right? Because
Yeah.
for the Germantown congregation, it, like, the church dissolved, yes, but Germantown continues, and I think I know that it's been frustrating for the congregation. They're like, we're still here, right?
Hmm.
Like, so how are you going to tell that story?
Yeah.
Right. And so
Mhm.
in every interview, I'm sure I make sure that I say that, because it's like, yes, the book ends, but maybe the church doesn't. And certainly the lives and journeys of the pastors don't.
Yeah, as we say, good stuff comes from the compost, even the compost of Christendom. But so I do want to talk a little bit about the that exhaustion or the trends, right? Like the trends are that, or I mean, not the trend, just the kind of what's happening in our culture is over the past 25 years, you note this, that 40 million Americans have stopped attending church. Um, and you know, one of the things I kind of wondered as I look at the other statistic here is 2021 Barna poll that said 46% of pastors, and this is important, under the age of 45 reported considering quitting full-time ministry. So a lot of young or relatively young pastors, almost half, have considered quitting, and 40 million Americans have basically quit church. And maybe it's that I don't know if you have thoughts on that. I mean, part of it is like we got so many other things that are weighing in on us. Like, is church going to be an energizing place or a draining place? Am I going to hear things that are offensive? And maybe sometimes it's just like I'm tired of all the things that are pulling on me. Do I have the energy for, you know, another thing? So I don't know. How do you read the signs of the times, Eliza, and how Circle of Hope kind of offers some commentary on that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, like, to look at the role that the media plays in that, I think as a reporter, as a journalist, I think we get it wrong. I think our assumption is that those tens of millions of people are just becoming secular, right? And many are, but lots of them are finding alternative forms of seeking, like whether, like, sure, yoga, but like if you ask people at Circle of Hope, which I did from the first time you and I went to church together, and like whatever, everybody was eating grapes and like can't remember what the other snack was at the in the back of the church at the end of the service. And I was like, "Do you guys consider yourself Christian?" And some people are like, "Yeah," and others are like, "No," and others are like, "I follow Jesus. I don't." So I think that yes, people are leaving their churches, but that doesn't mean they're leaving God.
Yeah.
And many are leaving church because they're following God in different ways. And I think Circle of Hope, I mean, Rod and Gwen White really didn't want to use the word church when they talked,
Hmm.
because they were afraid it would scare people off. And also, they weren't really sure that's what they wanted to be. So I don't think we have to be afraid of the changing shape of things. I think we have to be honest about it and pay attention to what's growing.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, if I might just
Yes,
offer my
yes,
thoughts, are that um, uh, that there is something to, it's difficult to restore something that has all of these complicated layers with a denomination. There's a generational piece. There's a predominantly white culture that's really hard to change within Circle of Hope or anywhere else. Um, and um, and and yet, I think a lot of us are finding a lot of life from being in spaces as white folks where we're a minority more often. I think I got a little glitchy, but yeah, like where we're a minority as white folks. So, we just held this red letter revival in Philly, and one night we had all African American womanist preachers. And a lot of what we're doing within Red Letter Christians is trying to create spaces that, as Reverend Barber says, we change the narrative by changing the narrators, right? Like get outside of the dominant white spaces and create something new. But it's hard to do that in a space that's been around for a while and that already has those structures. So, I mean, part of what I was feeling is for all the like incredible non-white leaders, African American and other leaders within Circle of Hope that have been trying to bring fresh life into this. And sometimes it works a while and then it just hits a dead end, right? And so like the question for me is like, how do we build something new together, And I mean, I guess in many ways it's what we're trying to do at Red Letter Christians, but I don't know if you have more thoughts because I mean, one of the things that you mentioned is this isn't just a circle thing. I mean, the Sierra Club, the ACLU, and I know a lot of folks that have worked for these organizations and they have some of the same dynamics, right? Where how do you like yes, we can really get into racial equity and justice, but then you hit the patriarchy side, and so there's like it's like you get hit on one side and then on another, and it's hard to kind of keep figuring all that out. But yeah, that's a lot of that's a big. I don't know where the question is, but help us, Eliza, help us.
no, it's so hard. I mean, I was in North Carolina yesterday, talking to these pastors, and one woman got so mad, and I felt like such a Yankee for this moment, but she stood up and she was like, it was so interesting. She feared I had not said a word about like racial makeup of her church. I didn't even know she was there, right? She stood up and she was like, we worship at St. Anne's and St. Luke's or whatever, worship at the same time, 11 a.m. on Sunday morning. And that is a black church and they have their own traditions and we have the pipe organ and they have their drums. And who are we to say they have to come over and worship with us? And I was like, whoa, I actually stole a line from Bethany Stewart, who's in the book. And I was just like, you are having a lot of feelings. Maybe you should sit with those, right? Because I was like, who told her? She is so threatened by a conversation that's like, maybe this is too white a space, that she has imagined that I have told her she must forcibly integrate a black church, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it was so interesting because I just thought when she was like, well, that's very arrogant. The black church probably doesn't want to integrate with us. And I'm like, yeah, they probably don't. Right. Like, so what is then like in the name of like, multiracial churches, are we asking too much of our leaders of color to be in spaces that aren't that good for them? Like lots of people I know who I respect so much, including former members of Circle, have written variations of why I left the white church.
Mm. Yeah.
Right.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I even thought of that one. The lines that you said you wrote about Bethany was, I mean, and she just comes across as such a powerhouse, and which she is. And but the that she had just cussed the pastor up and down. You said here's someone that cusses the pastor out up and down, and then still shows up to decorate the sanctuary for Christmas. So yeah, oh Lord, have mercy. Well, I am watching if anybody, we're almost out of time, but if anybody has a question, you can throw it in the chat or on the streams. But Eliza, any other closing thoughts as you think about this project and where we go from here, and what you want people to, what are the questions we could be asking right now?
Just gratitude, man.
Mm,
Gratitude for you and our friendship, but also the life that you lead with its own complexities, and the hits that you take to live this complicated life, and gratitude for the pastors and for the whites of this complicated gift that they gave me, and I hope it's not arrogant to say, but gave the world by allowing the world inside their lives for a while. I think I think this whole thing is still unfolding. I don't know what that means, and that I hope that I am bringing enough graciousness. I'm bringing all the graciousness I can to this process, but I'm not sure that's enough. So
mm,
that's kind of it.
mm. Well, I do think a lot of us are looking for community and belonging and love, and many of us are also looking for folks that we can try to follow Jesus together with. And a circle of hope, if anything, I think there's a lot of things that have shaped me and formed me through those friendships over the years. But we also can learn from the mistakes, from the humanity. And I was thinking of another Henry Nouwen quote. One of the things he said is, if we look closely into the face of another person, we can see our own face. Like we can see our own brokenness, we can see our own holiness, we can see our own capacity to do harm and our own capacity to bring life into the world. And he said that's why, we can see that in the face of the oppressed, our own face, and in the hands of the oppressors, our own hands. And I think as I was reading this, you really bring that out. You show um, um, the back, I mean, even the background of where people come from that shaped who they are, um, and the God working through the cracks of everything. I mean, that's probably my deepest theological statement these days is God works through the cracks of everything.
That's
So,
right.
uh,
That's exactly right. And my job is to show the cracks where they're cracks, and let people, yeah, let the light shine through that's innate to that process. All right. I am so grateful. Thank you so much for
yeah.
having me.
And my wife Katie sends her love. She was trying to join me, but it's exactly when the baby's going to bed. So we'll do another one of these sometimes, or just have you over for a little
I'd
time
love
together at
that.
our house.
I
So we
love
love
that.
you, and
I
thanks
love you
everybody
guys.
for tuning in. It's been wonderful. Make sure you check out the book Circle of Hope, Eliza Griswold, and
Thanks,
next
man.
month, yeah, next month our book is Womanish Theology. So
Nice.
do you know this
Okay.
one, Eliza?
No.
No.
Actually, I might. Who's the author?
Adams. Christy
Huh.
Lauren Adams.
I
So
don't.
thanks for
All right.
joining, y'all. Okay.
Okay. Bye.